Do you notice that they have the same amount of ink on them? Do you notice that they're made out of the same virtually worthless stuff? It's paper. Did you get it? It's paper. When we create money, we have created an instrument of value that has no value of its own. And it's just as expensive or inexpensive to print the 20 as it is to print the 1. I'm here to prove to you that bankers, especially in the Federal Reserve System, make multiplied trillions of dollars and never create one thing of value. Are you with me? You want to learn this or not? Are you sure? An automaker might make 1 or 2% profit. A builder might make 10% profit. But the printers of money have no limit to the amount of money they can create and the wealth that they can create for themselves. Money's the bloodline of a civilized society. It's the instrument by which a product is sold or bought. Reduce the supply of money below the necessary levels to sustain trade. Reduce the amount of this in the system below the levels necessary to sustain the current trade, and you create a depression. In 1930, let me ask you a question. Did we not have farms? In 1930, did we not have factories? Did we have the greatest roadway system in the world at that time? Yes. Did we have the greatest communication system in the world at that time? Yes. Did we have the greatest opportunity of trade with oceans on both sides and water systems like the Mississippi River running through the width and breadth of this nation? Did we have ability to move our goods and services? Yes. Did we have transportation and roadways? Yes. What did we not? Did we lack workers? Then what happened? I'll tell you what happened. The bankers decided no more money for you. They got out of the stock market. I can give you the family names. They got out of the stock market the year before. Do you know all the money that was lost in the stock market as people began to sell their stocks one after the other, after the other, after the other, and stocks that were valued at $10,000 were selling for 15 cents? And then they had to make a run on the bank because the banks, the stock market had said, oh, I'll tell you what you can do. You can borrow on margin. In other words, you can buy, the economy's really good here in the late 20s. Here's what you can do. You can borrow on margin for stocks. You can buy a stock at $100 worth of stock. You can buy it for $10, and we'll lend you the other money to buy the stock, and the stock is skyrocketing, so you stand to make a great profit. What they didn't tell the American people, and what you still don't know today, is that when they did that, they also put into that legislation that they would have a 24-hour recall. In other words, however much stock you bought, it would make a lot of money, but they could call that stock in, and you would be required not only to pay for the stock, but to pay for what you borrowed at interest from them. In other words, now you got to pay the $100 that they loaned you, but they're the ones that are calling it in. So when they called it in, you didn't have the money to pay for it, so you ran to the bank. But the bank only keeps 20% money on hand. They loan the rest of it out, so only 20% of the people could get any of their money out of the bank. So the banks collapsed, the stock market collapsed, all at the whim of the bankers who decided they wanted to make the money. Watch me. Watch me. All that stuff was being sold. $100,000 farms were selling for $3,000. Who do you think bought them? Why are you looking at me funny? You know what you're looking at? You're looking like sheep that have been led to the slaughter and didn't know it. I'm going to continue. Can I continue? We didn't lack industrial capability. If you don't believe me, I just told you what started the Great Depression. Let me tell you what ended it. World War II. And all of a sudden, the same banks that said no money for farms, no money for food, put people in soup lines, no money for commerce, no money for railroads, no money for roads, no money, no money. All of a sudden said, war? And all of a sudden, factories that were closed down began to work 3 shifts. Where'd the money come from? The same pockets that refused to give it before. Because they decide when it will be printed, how much will be printed, and how much usury or interest will be paid. Not the federal government. The federal government has no say in it, as I will prove to you. Say debt is a devil. By the simple manipulation of a few wealthy bankers, World War II ended the Great Depression. After successive failures to convince the public of the need of a central bank by wars, these same European bankers financed both sides of the Civil War in this country. You don't even know that. Same bankers, same families, financed both sides of the Civil War. Why? They make the money. After they couldn't get the American people to swallow the lie of a central bank by creating war, they decided they would artificially create, listen to me, recessions, depressions, inflations, and panics. Since only a small amount of deposits are stored at the bank, about 20%, the other 80% is out on loan with security of property and your promise to pay it back. A simple rumor of a bank's insolvency would make a run on that bank. Everybody'd get nervous, go pull their money out of the bank, and that bank would collapse. And then the international bankers who started the rumor in the first place would look like prophets. P-R-O-P-H-E-T-S, prophet. Are you hearing something you've never known? Wave your hand. If you think America ought to know, wave your other hand. All right, then don't quit on me. One of the key movers and shakers of this, let's get a central bank by making the people afraid by causing their banks to collapse. One of the key movers and shakers was a man by the name of, you might recognize it, J.P. Morgan. His father was an agent for the wealthy, you might know this name, Rothschild family. Here's a quote. The Federal Reserve. In 1869, J.P. Morgan went to London and reached an agreement for a company known as the Northern Securities that was intended to act as the international bank, as the agent for the Rothschild Company in the United States. The first major panic created by the international bankers occurred in 1893, when local bankers from around the nation were told to call in all their loans. Told by who? By these wealthy bankers. Senator Robert Owen testified before a congressional committee that the call on the banks, watch, testified before a congressional committee that the bank he owned, this was a senator, received from the National Bankers Association what came to be known as the Panic Circular of 1893. It stated, you will at once retire 1/3 of your circulation and call in 1/2 of all your loans. Why? Because that makes the bank collapse.
the U.S. government can't go bankrupt because we can print our own money.
It obviously begs the question, why exactly are we borrowing in a currency that we print ourselves? I'm waiting for someone to stand up and say, why do we borrow our own currency in the first place?
Like you said, they print the dollar. So why does the government even borrow?
Well, I mean, again, some of this stuff gets, some of the language that some of the language and concepts are just confusing. I mean, the government definitely prints money, and it definitely lends that money, which is why the government definitely prints money, and then it lends that money by selling bonds. Is that what they do? They sell bonds. Yeah, they sell bonds, right? Because they sell bonds and people buy the bonds and lend them the money. Yeah. So a lot of times, at least to my ear with MMT, the language and the concepts can be kind of unnecessarily confusing, but there is no question that the government prints money and then it uses that money to yeah, I guess I can't really talk. I don't get it. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, because it's like the government clearly prints money. It does it all the time, and it clearly borrows. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this debt and deficit conversation. So I don't think there's anything confusing there.
Under the form of government which we have inherited from our ancestors, our Constitution is so simple, so practical, that it is possible always to meet extraordinary needs by changes in emphasis and arrangement without loss of essential form. That is why our constitutional system has proved itself the most superbly enduring political mechanism the modern world has ever seen. It has met every stress of vast expansion of territory, of foreign wars, of bitter internal strife, of world relations. And it is to be hoped that the normal balance of executive and legislative authority may be fully equal, fully adequate to meet the unprecedented task before us. But it may be that an unprecedented demand and need for undelayed action may call for temporary departure from that normal balance of public procedure. I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures, or such other measures, as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. For the trust reposed in me, I will return the courage and the devotion that befits the time.
I can do no less. We face the arduous days that lie before us in the warm courage of national unity, with the clear consciousness of seeking old and precious moral values.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is the Commoner Law Group special expert introduction to equity. How can you apply equity in your life? You were just listening to the voice of our past president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during his first inaugural address, threatening to use emergency powers to take over basically the economy of the United States. And within 36 hours, he fulfilled on that threat. And we're going to learn a lot more about the history of how money has been manipulated, how money isn't money, and much more. But again, thank you very much for being here. My name is Clint Grease. We've got a presentation prepared for you by some amazing experts who have been working in the world of equity and applying it in people's lives to real effect, real success stories. And it's going to be a very great note to you. I personally have been studying equity for some time and looking and researching to find some experts who could partner with the Commoner Law Group to bring forth an education for you all to explain all of the complexities of equity. Although you'll find in the end it comes down to some pretty simple maxims. But the complexity comes from basically starting from the fact that we all live in a deception. And the hardest part is to really relieve us of the illusion that we live in. And so a lot of the work that we have to do in this education is just that, unlearning what we thought we knew and being surprised by the truth of how, quote unquote, money actually works and the surprising advantages that there are for you in your personal life. So today I'd invite you to begin by setting aside just about any ideas that you have about the way things work, about the way the law works, about the way money works, and be open to hear a new story, a refreshing story, really an inspiring story, a story that will allow you to seek remedy for nearly any problem you have in your life, any public debt, any public controversy, even if you're in the criminal situation and you haven't actually committed a crime, you have a new source of remedy, and it's very, very good news. So thank yourselves for coming today. I understand there's a lot going on in life, and there's a lot of things pulling you in different directions. But I want to ask you to give your attention to two wonderful men who are taking their time out tonight too. They do a lot of speaking, and they're in great demand. So we're lucky to have Michael Joseph of the Sacred Honor Educational Fellowship. He's the founding director. And we also have Phil Mederi, the equity director of the Sacred Honor Educational Fellowship. And what they're going to do today is introduce to you the concept of equity, give you some of the history to help you understand it's not a new thing. It's in the Constitution. It's right there in Article 3, Section 2. It gives the courts authority to adjudicate cases in both law and equity. And so there's a lot to learn tonight, but between Michael and Phil, you're going to get a quick education, and you're going to learn also how it applies to you in your life today and how you can take advantage of it in very real, very material ways in the near term. So thanks, guys, for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks, Clint. I have to say, that was an amazing intro, especially that pastor who's just nailing it. He's nailing it. And that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right around 1933, 1934. And can you just hear the sincerity in his voice? Such a sincere man.
Calling on morality and virtue and the American dream and all of these wonderful things as cover, really, to assert his dictatorial authority over the money.
Yeah. And they needed someone who had that appeal with the people to to be okay with giving those emergency powers over at that period of time to make those changes. And the fireside chats and all these things, you know, built that all that trust and camaraderie. And then it was the old bait and switch.
Yes, well, that's the good news slash bad news. Everything we hear tonight, it's unsettling on one level, but what I want to let everyone know, and the reason I'm so excited about this presentation and about equity in general, is that there is a new refreshing remedy for all of us. So as we take the medicine, the pill, there's definitely some sugar to help it go down.
I just want to start out by saying how important it is that we are assembling, and we're assembling because we all have a common thread in our lives, and the thread is that we realize that something is not right with what is going on around us. Okay, now we could get down that rabbit hole and get philosophical and talk about right and wrong and what a judgment is, but I'm going to avoid all that and just say there's something out there that is creating a conscious energy that is utilizing our creative force to manifest something that they want, not something that we want. So what I love to talk about first is to help us realize everything that we do in the fellowship is to help us realize that we are the currency. We are the real power of the system. The system, as we'll talk about, and some of you may get this already, the system itself, the public system, is a hollow box. It's a fiction. It has no animation to it without our energy, right? So I often say we're the currency of the system, and that's what I mean. So I want to start out by saying that, because as we're unpacking some stuff in the next hour, you'll start to see that picture unpack a little bit, because ultimately that's what all of this is about. We always talk about the bridgeways out of Babylon, the bridgeways out of the Matrix. But truthfully, what we're talking about is the substance over the form. The form is the system. The form are all these papers and documents and processes that the system tries to make us think is the authority and the power. But the truth of the matter is it's the substance that is the power. So I'm sounding like that pastor in the first section. But that is really the truth. That's like the overarching and underarching and circular truth of all of this, is that we're the currency.
Well, when you say currency, it's the vitality, it's the energy, it's the creative life force that God gave to us. We are here to create.
Yeah. There's a way to harness that, you know, the bait and switch that we were talking about with FDR. You know, the banking emergency, essentially, the emergency superseded Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, where gold and silver were lawful tender. And so it was under this emergency, those powers he was just talking about, where they were able to lay this public policy on top of the Constitution. They never amended the Constitution. So, you know, the necessity of the emergency created the custom of switching to legal tender. But also what happened at the exact same time is necessity created equity in the situation. Because when there's an inequitable situation, equity steps in. It's called concurrent equity. It adapts and is malleable to the situation to always give it the remedy.
So I'm probably going to maybe spend the next 10 minutes creating a little bit of context. And some of it's going to correlate to what FDR was talking about and what Phil was just saying about the Emergency Act. We got War Powers Acts that were put into place after the Civil War. A lot of stuff took place after the Civil War during the Reconstruction period. And one of those things was the enactment of the Lieber Code. So that was the enactment of the War Powers, which it just enabled Lincoln and the officials or president or whatever we want to call them after that point to do a lot of different things. And one of the things they did, and why all these, like the 13th and 14th Amendments and all these were never ratified, is because they created a corporate constitution, which was different than the original Republic Constitution. So you might often hear people say, oh, the original organic Constitution. That's what people are talking about. There's a distinction between the two constitutions. And that's why nothing needed to be ratified. They just said, okay, well, this is a corporate state and we can make the rules as we want because this is our world. We created it. The one who creates controls, right? It's a simple maxim. So I'll start out by saying some things that you guys may know. So pardon me if I'm saying things that you know. Some of you, you're all at different levels, but it helps paint a picture, and repetition is a good teacher. So I'm just going to start with that. Let's step back during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. And I'll start out by saying that there's a clear distinction between the United States Federal Corporation and United States of America, the Republic. They're two separate entities. All right. I like simple evidence. You can Google 28 USC 3002 subsection 15, and it'll say that under definitions what the United States is, and it says it's a federal corporation, right? So they're not trying to hide it. So the way that I like to explain it, if some of you have heard the kind of all the excitement of private membership associations and all that kind of stuff, PMAs have been kind of a big buzzword since the big COVID push. People are looking for ways to privatize their lives. So PMAs became a massive buzzword, which it's awesome, right? And there's a lot to learn about that. So the way that I like to explain it is the federal corporation is kind of like a private club that somebody else created. And we got bound into that private club through a contract or a bunch of contracts. All right. So now with that stated, let's go to the 14th Amendment and talk about the Bill of Rights. And we get into language differences. So the Bill of Rights has language where it says people with land, rights. It even uses the word person twice, if I remember correctly. And then you fast forward to the 14th Amendment, and suddenly the language goes strictly to persons with benefits, privileges, and immunities. So you see here that it says persons, and then it gets into benefits, privileges, and immunities. The difference in the language is one is contractual language. If you guys ever take the time to read contracts, even your phone, like when you're going to get a cell phone or whatever, you read if you actually take the time to read those ridiculous contracts, ridiculous as in long, you'll see in there that they talk about benefits and privileges or benefits. Well, that's contractual language. Benefits and privileges aren't rights. They're distinctly different. That starts indicating that there's something that happened after the Civil War with this 14th Amendment language. This is one of those situations where they lean into tacit agreements or applied agreements, or if somebody sends you an offer several times, and if you don't rebuke the offer or rebuke whatever it is that they're making a claim against, suddenly you've fallen into the category of that jurisdiction. And that's just how contracts work. Crazily enough, if you don't do anything to stand in your power, then suddenly it becomes law, becomes fact. So that's kind of how they played it, right? So we became free men and women on the land, and we came off that land and found our way into a contract through the 14th Amendment into the federal corporation. All right, so that's kind of how that little sleight of hand took place. Why is it important to understand the 14th Amendment as a contract and the Bill of Rights is natural? Because Article 1, Section 10 states that I'm going to paraphrase, the state cannot impair upon the obligation of a contract, right? So that just means if Clint and I got into an agreement and it was in the law, we say is in that agreement, we draft those rules, that becomes law. Nothing outside of that contract can be law. So the law is in the contract, not outside of it, right? So that's a simple thing to grok about contract law. And it's really important to get this. So what happens a lot of times is, let's say Clint and I decide we're going to get into an agreement, and instead of making a private agreement, and we're going to draft into that contract that the jurisdiction is in the state of California. Now suddenly we have what's called a third-party intervener in our private affair. And the law is in the contract. So basically what we did is we allowed jurisdiction of the state to dictate their rules and regulations into our contract instead of just our contract being our agreement. It's tricky, but that's how it works. So I love to explain those distinctions because it really kind of helps paint a picture. I do want to share one other thing, because this happens a lot and people face this a lot, and it's confusing, especially since what I like to call the COVID period, where people were jumping up and down and screaming about their constitutional rights. I'd love to explain the situation because it helps galvanize what I'm sharing. Let's say you're standing in front of a judge, and it's because the IRS made a claim against you and said you owed them $20,000 and you didn't pay, so you're in dishonor, and they're getting the judge to hold you into account. So you show up to court and you think you're clever because you know a little bit about the Constitution, and you say, Judge, you need to dismiss this under the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure. Okay, that's a reasonable idea. And you do that because you know that the judge has private papers, like, you know, he's got documents from the bank account and sent some goons into your house to steal your private property to use against you. And you're like, no, 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 unreasonable search and seizure, drop this. And the judge says the Constitution has no place in this matter, right? So that blows most people's socks off, because isn't the Constitution the supreme law of the land? Of course it is. But what the judge is not saying is, I'm here to compel the performance of a contract you don't realize you're in. So what is that contract? W-2, W-4, I-9, 1040, 1041, on and on and on and on and on and on. Contract after contract after contract we find ourselves in. I want to make another point. When I'm talking about the law is inside the contract, if Clint and I decided that we wanted to have our own language in that contract and we wrote our own terms and definitions in that contract, that means whatever we decide a word means, that's the law. So in 1828, we got the Webster's Dictionary of 1828 that created the definitions of the words in the Constitution. And when you get into words in the Constitution, like the word person, it talks about a natural being, a sentient man or woman. And then if you fast forward and you get into the Black's Law dictionaries, which is the dictionaries that defines the words in the United States Federal Corporation. So this is Black's Law. Yeah. So in general uses human being through by statute term may include labor organizations, partnerships, associations, corporations, et cetera, right? So this really galvanizes the point. There are nuances, and they matter. They absolutely matter. You know, it's got a completely different terminology because they understand law. They know that the law is in the contract. So when we find ourselves in these contracts through the 14th Amendment and we become members of the federal corporation, that means we're bound by the statutes and codes that they created. They're their rules. And we're not party to that contract. We're subject to the contract. There's a big difference between the two. But it really helps to get how contract law functions, because they are absolute masters at creating invisible contracts. If you guys haven't read this book, you're missing out. It's a thickie, but man, it's worth it. As a matter of fact, they don't print this anymore. Somebody's going to have to print it for you, but you can find it if you look for it. It was a life-changing book for me. It was written in the 80s, and it was talking about people during the tax protest period, and there was hundreds of thousands of them, and they were trying to fight the law through statutes and codes, and they were getting their ass handed to them until somebody wrote them a letter and said, you guys don't realize you're in these contracts. Let me show you what's happening. And that changed everything. It matters to know this. It matters. In 1872, the Organic Act actually created the 10 square miles of Washington, D.C., which became the jurisdiction of the corporate United States. And how they got jurisdiction over outside of the 10 square miles is they created all these municipal corporations across the country in this, like what I call invisible blanket. So back in the day, actually it still exists, but I like to expand it that way. California was the California State Republic, right? Missouri State Republic. And then if you're in the municipal corporation of the federal United States, it suddenly became the state of California, the state of Texas, the state of Missouri. So one is the original republic and the other one are municipal corporations that's housed within the jurisdiction of Washington, D.C. And they created all these fictional ties like zip codes and all that stuff that draw you into that jurisdiction through contracts and through consent. Consent. Big word there. So many of you already know 1913, the installation of the private bank, Federal Reserve, the central banking system was installed. Interesting fact, there's a cat by the name of Edward Mandell House who wrote a book in 1912 called Philip Drew Administrator. And what's fascinating about that book is it talks about the exact step-by-step process of how the United States was taken over and turned into a corporate state through military intervention, right? So if you take away military and you add the word subversion, you have the exact process how the country was taken over and everything that we're experiencing today, written in 1912. So here's the fascinating part. In 1913, during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, who installed the Federal Reserve or helped it install, Edward Mandell House was special advisor to Woodrow Wilson. You fast forward to 1933, guess who was special advisor to Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Edward Mandell House, that guy again. So he's got a lot of ties with the Rothschild banking family. So obviously he was brought over here to help install the Federal Reserve and help install the debt slave system and to install that corporate state, which is what we're seeing today. So let's talk about what happened in 1933. The corporate United States was there. Most people really weren't that aware of it. The corporate state was there, and they needed to kind of move to the next stage to galvanize the debt slave system. They purposely bankrupt the corporate United States, and then they instituted what was called the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. Basically, that was saying that the federal corporation's in bankruptcy. So they created a bunch of public policy, HJR 192, and what is it?
Public Law 7310.
And essentially what happened in that period is they needed to move all the substance of our money away because the substance was protecting us from the debt, right? Any debts. So the substance at the time was gold, and they removed the gold as a substance and they replaced it with the people. All right? So, and that's all part of the HJR 192 and all these other public policies that they created. Essentially, we became the surety of the debt for the public system voluntarily as 14th Amendment citizens. That was the same period where the Social Security system came into play and the Public Charitable Trust and the Siskiyou Trust and the bonds of the birth certificate and all that stuff came into play. And the reason all that stuff came into play is because when the cronies from the federal state borrowed these whatever amounts of dollars from the banking families wanted collateral. So what did they do? They put up the people as persons, as corporate entities. They leaned against the people for our future labor through taxation. So when our tax dollars go, whenever those tax dollars are paid or confiscated, they actually go to pay the bank loans to the globalists. And then the corporate state keeps borrowing money from them. That's why it's a secular debt-based system. It can't exist without debt. So now we're up to whatever 38 trillion ridiculous amount of money. And the reason it's getting there, if you guys ever pay attention to the World Economic Forum in Klaus Anel Schwab, he always talks about you'll own nothing and be happy. So what they're saying is eventually we're going to come in and we're going to pull those liens and we're going to carry all that. So they leaned against the persons, they leaned against our public property, and they leaned against our private property. That's what happened. And they're municipal bonds. And it still exists today. And they're working on cashing in on all that. And that's what we do at the fellowship. We try to help people become aware of that and protect themselves from what's coming. Right? It's a tricky little sleight of hand, but that is exactly what is going on. The original organic constitution was written and designed to limit the legislative powers of government so the people could self-govern. We were never meant to have a third-party intervention in our private affairs. The country was designed to help us work that way. We wanted to get away from something that was telling us how we should and shouldn't exist. And we don't need the permission to exist, right? And that's what we're all starting to realize. We're like, how do we get there? What's the orientation of that? The design is that we build our lives in the private and we stay in the private. And if you run into what we call frictions in the corporate state or the commercial public, then the trustees have the power of determination to navigate the affair when they're educated. And if you're not able to navigate that, then you put on your bookkeeping hat and you settle and close the account through equity jurisprudence. And that's what we're going to share with you guys today. It's phenomenal. And it really finds your way back into the power when you realize the way the system was set up actually is a pretty amazing benefit for us once we lean into it and we realize how it works. And we see that we really are the power when we know what hat to put on at the right time. All right, so what I'd like to do is just stop right there and then get into equity, because equity is what we call the ultimate remedy. And you lean into equity when you're in the public system in a way which we call you're in some element of dishonor. So that story I said earlier about somebody standing in front of a judge and they're throwing up their hands, all upset because their constitutional rights are not being honored because the judge says the Constitution has no place here. Well, that guy's waving his arm is the one who's in dishonor because he was in a contract that he wasn't honoring, right? So he wasn't honoring himself, one, because he wasn't aware of what he was in. That unto itself is a dishonor. I'm not saying there's not deception there, but we find ourselves in all kinds of dishonor. And the reason I want to bring this up is because we have to move away from the victim space in all of this. We love to just yell and scream and say it's somebody else's fault, but the truth is we can't find a way to salvation when we're the victim. You're not a sovereign power if you're a victim. So be in your strength and be in your sovereignty and realize who you are. And wash away, take all that energy of victimhood and turn it into the power of you and know who you are. That is an important element of moving through all of this. And equity holds you into account and that power. You can't be a victim and use equity. It doesn't work. All right, Phil is the equity director to the Sacred Honor Educational Fellowship. And I'd love to unpack equity from that standpoint and how it works within the Foundations for Self-Governance to settle and close all commercial affairs. So let's unpack that context so we can move to the next level.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Hey, everybody. I'm Phil Mederi, Equity Director at the Sacred Honor Educational Fellowship. So excited to be here talking about equity today. That started in 1933, okay? We already established the fact that there was this new person born back in the 14th Amendment. Now, who was walking around before that? Who did the Bill of Rights apply to? Well, I bet they breathed and have had their feet on the ground and could see colors and had feelings and emotions. And this new person that they're talking about in the 14th Amendment is a fiction on a piece of paper. It's in a filing drawer in Washington, D.C. somewhere. So I want everybody to think in those terms, all right? So we have I like to say that on the natural, if we talk about a looking glass, on one side we have the natural and the reflection is the fiction, because the fiction wouldn't exist unless the natural created it in the first place. So there needed to be a way. Tompkins versus Erie Railroad, 1938. That was when state common law was no longer sufficient to handle the commercial nature of these transactions. And there was also legal fictions cannot have intercourse with natural beings. There has to be another legal fiction that it has intercourse with in commerce. They tied it all together around that time after the money change. And what we ended up with was essentially the suretyship Michael talked about how the living, breathing, sentient being becomes the suretyship for this legal fiction who owes the debt. So there's something called implied partnership I want to bring up for a minute. Implied partnership is based on conduct of the parties, okay? You don't even have to have an explicit partnership. It's if you're conducting yourself in a business arrangement with another entity, then the law says that you're banned or stopped from denying this partnership exists. So if we're walking around using this US citizens credentials in any manner or way, what does our conduct say about, should we be the suretyship for that entity or not? Are we in a business partnership or not? And that's just implied partnership and implied contract. Well, what about the explicit ones we're talking about? What about the birth certificate? What about the social security number? Okay, so there's a web of contracts, as Michael's been talking about, that just ties us into this thing. So to set that context, I want to rewind to 1933. All right, golden nature is substance, because the only thing that is in the mirror and the fictional reflection is a fiction. It's this hollow box, as Michael said. So we need something natural, something of substance, something that's tangible to be the transmission of power, the transmission of value. So when they took away the gold and silver, it's this new credit system is backed by the people of the nation, all the people of the nation and their property. Okay, so what that did is it created a liability on the US citizen or the fictional business partner, and it required and equity created a power on the sentient moral being side of the equation. That's where the substance lies. Okay, now we can't be told that this is the way the system's built, because that would compromise the element of control. So let's just establish that for a minute. So they can't ask us to apply our substance nicely and let us know that we have this. And there are people in the system who are in the know and have known this since 1933, because just another side point, legal tender is not just Federal Reserve notes, those notes that are in your wallet. It's actually negotiable instruments. And there's a whole list of what that entails as legal tender. Okay, so let's take our mind away from money. Okay, money doesn't exist anymore. All right, we have legal tender. And so there's a way to apply our substance through this mechanism. It was built into HJR 192 and Public Law 7310. Equity was written in. All right, they had to, as I alluded to before. There was no constitutional amendment. It would have been treason. They had to give a remedy in the public policy. So that's where it was born. Okay, and it applies to the natural substance that we carry around, as Clint said earlier, our creative energy. That's the true transmission in the system. So how do you harness that? How do you extract that from the people of the nation? Well, let's create a scheme that I think Edward Mandell House in his letter to Woodrow Wilson, in those words, essentially only 1 in a million can figure out this plan. And if they do, guess what? There's plausible deniability, because that's built into the system. And it also talks about the ancient system of pledging. Okay, if you look up the definition of pledge and follow those words down the rabbit hole, you eventually get to a chattel, and chattel can be inanimate or animate. Okay, and what it is movable property that can be inanimate or animate. Okay, who's animate? Okay, that's a living life form, but that can be personal property, and it's under chattel. Okay, so that's just to throw that out there.
Should I read this little?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is pulled from Woodrow Wilson's personal papers from a conversation that he had with Edward Mandell House. And this is somewhere between 1913 and 1921. And Woodrow Wilson allowed his papers to come out because he was trying to claim innocent for the installation, that he was just saying, oh, I didn't know what was going on. Yeah, whatever. All right, so this comes from his private papers. Very soon, every American will be required to register their biological property in a national system designed to keep track of the people, and that will operate under the ancient system of pledging. By such methodology, we can compel people to submit to our agenda, which will affect our security as a chargeback for our fiat paper currency. Every American will be forced to register or suffer not being able to work and earn a living. Sound familiar? They will be our chattel, and we will hold the security interest over them forever, by operation of law merchant under the scheme of secured transactions. Americans, by unknowingly or unwittingly delivering the bills of lading to us, will be rendered bankrupt and insolvent, forever to remain economic slaves through taxation secured by their pledges. They will be stripped of their rights and given a commercial value designed to make us a profit, and they will be none the wiser, for not one man in a million could ever figure out our plans. And if by accident 1 or 2 figure it out, we have in our arsenal plausible deniability. After all, this is the only logical way to fund government, by floating liens and debt to the registrants in the form of benefits and privileges. This will inevitably reap us huge profits beyond our wildest expectations and leave every American a contributor to this fraud that we will call social insurance. Without realizing it, every American will insure us for any loss we may incur, and in this manner, every American will unknowingly be our servant, however begrudgingly. The people will become helpless and without any hope for their redemption, and we will employ the high office of the president of our dummy corporation to ferment this plot against America. I don't think they were hiding it. We just didn't understand the language.
Absolutely. And this substance transfer that we're talking about, the secure transactions, and when you dig into those words that are in that letter, because in equity, we really love to extract the equity and read with equity eyes out of the books and follow the words down the rabbit hole. Synonyms in Burton's legal thesaurus are very potent to find out a deeper meaning to how the words correlate. And you take some of those words out of that letter and you run them in to see what they really mean against the synonyms and look at those definitions. And it's written into the law. It's exactly, it's happening in court every day. Secure transactions. That's what the bonds are. The bonds are a way to move the value from the private over to the public with a contractual consent that we may not even know we're in. Okay. So this is how complex it gets down to, but they built it into the law. And so there's a way that we have a liability of the US citizen to bear the burden of what we just heard in that letter, bear the burden of the public debt, bear the burden of all these things. And then as a sentient moral being, we have the power to authorize credit, because the credit is our energy. So the true creditor in the system, so to speak, is the living, breathing human beings. We're the only ones that can create value. There's mechanisms in place to be able to apply that value and apply it properly to discharge these matters, because as I said before, we can pay in quotes with Federal Reserve notes. Okay, well, a note is a type of negotiable instrument. There's two classes of negotiable instruments. There's notes, and then there's bills and drafts. Okay, they're all legal tender when they're properly managed. Okay, so that's the mechanics of it, and that's another subject in itself, but that's the foundation of it. So first I want to, with what's been shared so far, I want to begin with the things that we know. Okay, it appears from the letter from Edward Mandell House and everything else we've seen in the videos earlier that they want consenting slaves. Okay, and this is a system designed of contracts, and it's meant to ensnare us all. So in essence, this system is one of financial servitude, and it's designed to drain the natural substance that we've just been talking about. So commercial and legal debt burdens are imposed to control and oppress, because if we were taught about the natural power we have, we wouldn't be involved in all these shenanigans that are going on. So I know a lot of you are a part of the Parallel Society or know about it. I mean, there's a lot of health conscious people out there. There's also, as we've been talking about, the awareness of this fiat money scam that's going on. So we're looking for solutions, because I know there's plenty of sources out there. You can go and hear all this news, and information's one thing, but having a solution or being goal oriented to have something to offer that can change people's lives and bring people into a place of empowerment despite the system that's around us at this time. So we're in a paradigm shift here. Okay, there's a consciousness shift happening where all things natural are making a comeback, and natural law is no different. Okay, moving forward, having the natural divine law to access and apply in these situations is the ace of spades. Okay, and that's what we're looking to do here, folks. We're looking to introduce this natural law back in and see where it fits into this present system. So, and Michael mentioned earlier that equity, we call the ultimate remedy, because equity is remedial justice. It looks to focus on remedy and bring fairness and justice to every situation. And it acts on human beings. It's the law designed for human beings as it works on men and women. And it acts in personam. So it doesn't matter what office someone's clothed in, because that is a public matter. Now we're talking about private individual rights here. That's what we're focusing on. So I know there's a lot of people out there struggling with this debt. I mean, I've seen some statistics recently that I'm going to share with you in a minute, that just insane stuff going on with debt out there. So much burden hanging over people's heads to keep up this, like Michael was saying, the lien on all the private property, public property, and us as chattel. Okay, big words there. So there's also expanding insanity with all the interest rates now. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day, back when it was the church kind of was the law back before, in the early days of this nation, it was considered usury to charge 20% interest on loans. That's commonplace now. So these interest rates are crazy. And there's also so many liens, levies, and liabilities with taxing agencies. I mean, they're putting on all these new agents that come after everybody and things like that. So that's definitely turning up the heat there. And also, these legal burdens and unjust obligations with these contracts we've been discussing, the ones we're even aware of, a lot of them we're not. Okay, so those are all things that are on the radar. And I know, just like I always did, I always knew there was something more to the system. I always knew there was another way. And that's what led me to equity eventually. When I found it, I knew it. And I was introduced to it back in 2008. And it changed my life. Having this awareness of the true power that we hold because we're living and breathing. And we get up in the morning and pull up our pants one leg at a time, and we go out and create what we create that day. That's our power. That's the substance that we're talking about. So we just talked about how contracts are the supreme law of the land, okay? Michael talked about how things are written into the contract. That becomes the law. That becomes the definitions. And they can't be impaired, okay? However, I want to let you all know in a little secret here, equity is a civil remedy. And contracts are civil, and equity follows the contracts to the letter. Okay, but there is a remedy. As I said, equity is remedial justice, and there's always a remedy. And that's the beautiful thing about it. So I won't go further into that right now because I have a lot more to talk about, okay? We talked about equity. Clint mentioned Article 3, Section 2, Clause 1 of the United States Constitution in law and equity. And then it mentions admiralty maritime in there too. So those are the three types of law forms in the Constitution and common law countries typically. The great thing about equity is it's not bound by strict laws or statutes. In fact, it's above all of that. It comes before it, it comes after it, and it runs all the way through it. And Clint alluded to how equity is actually pretty simple. You get down to it, it's based on principles. And it's called the unwritten law. And the reason is because these principles, when they're adhered to, that's the way equity is exercised. And we talked about conduct before. Or if we're conducting ourselves in accordance with the equitable maxims, and it's in our heart and it's in our conduct and our words and our actions, that's the way equity is applied. It's not about knowing all the statutes and codes in this volume or that volume and having to go through and incite all of that stuff. In fact, Michael was alluding to with the Invisible Contracts book. Those guys knew all those codes, but they didn't know about the contracts and the power of the contract. And that's what got them in trouble. And that's happening all the time today because there's a lot of good people out there that know there's a better way, but they're playing in this system that the contracts are superseding all of these common law remedies and even things at law and the statutory. And if there's a contract hiding in the background, then none of that matters. It's only about the contract. So a couple of stats here. In 2022, the average household debt of American families weighed in at a staggering $125,000 plus. Okay, that's including mortgages, but that's over $126,000 per household was the average. Okay, and then the IRS debt in 2021, $688 billion in unpaid taxes. That's a lot of change, and they're adding new agents supposedly to collect on that. The average student loan debt in 2023, they're over $38,000. So, and it's even hard to get a job to repay that. And the thing about student loan debts, those are something you can't even declare bankruptcy on. So that's supposedly a debt that is undischargeable. And just for 1 second, a bankruptcy is a public discharge. Equity offers us the remedy because it acts in the private and on individuals to create a discharge privately. And it doesn't have to be contractual like a public discharge. So that's a distinction to make too, because this is a private remedy instead of a public contractual, because public means we have a contract with the third party intervener, as Michael's talking about. Okay, there's a judge involved in that one. We don't need any of that with our private remedy. Sure, the judge may be the one that has to discharge it in some matters because they are agent of the public. However, we can create that on our own. So 2022, IRS collected more than 4.9 trillion, okay, from taxpayers. And again, the way the system works, the more we get to know how everything's working, that's more for keeping people oppressed and in the system than it is actually to fund anything, because there's a whole other financing scheme going on out there with secure transactions and securities market and all of that kind of stuff, which I won't go further into that right now. So anyway, I just want to say, can you imagine learning something that when something comes in the mailbox with your name on it, a piece of paper, a negotiable instrument, okay, comes in the mail with your name on it, what do? Do you know about all of your power? I mean, I'm sure you know about the liabilities that come along with it. They let you know about that on the instrument. But what about your power? Okay, that's what equity provides for us. And the confidence that comes along with that when we know how to manage these offers that we call them, they're contractual offers, essentially. The UCC says, if you look up dishonor in the Uniform Commercial Code, it says a failure to accept. All right. So there's a tacit agreement on these instruments that if we do not know how to handle them properly, then we fall into a contract. And when we're in the contract, that's how people get in trouble, because they don't even know it.
According to the UCC, if we don't accept something, we're in dishonor. Just take that in for just a minute. So what's interesting about it, I know Phil's going to unpack it, is equity helps you comprehend and embody how we have the power to accept everything and discharge it, right? That's the crux of equity. But it's important to get the essence of it. And Phil's talking more of the essence. So thank you. I just want to really galvanize that. It's important to get.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. And talking about the essence. So there's a lot of wisdom that comes from the scriptures. Okay. They're wisdom commands, and a lot of the equitable maxims, because it is natural law, are taken from that text. And I want to draw a comparison between the golden rule, do unto others as you want done to you, to the equitable maxim of the one seeking equity must do equity. Okay. So take that in for a minute. We need to embody it first before it can be cognized and received. So this is self-work as well as it is focusing the energy out. Okay. I want to share a real life success story real quick and show you little hint of what equity can do. Okay. So a while back, I had Sally come to me, and she had an issue during the pandemic. They gave out all that unemployment stuff. Okay. Well, somehow people got overpaid. Some people, the people didn't know it. They were just filing like as instructed, but now the employment development department or unemployment comes later on and says, you owe us money. So they were telling Sally that she owed $10,000. All right. And this is money she used to survive and pay her bills during the pandemic. And they're threatening collection actions with the taxing agencies and possible court judgments and things like that. And so Sally came and was in a state of panic, honestly. And so luckily she came across me and we started talking, and then, I told her about equity. Okay. So this is great stuff. It took about 5 mailings or 5 correspondence exchanges with this agency. And then we received a letter that simply said, this case has been closed. Further collection actions have been canceled. If you've made any payments, we are going to refund them to you. No further action is needed. Okay. So it goes from, we're going to burn you at the cross to, you know, we're going to refund anything you've paid in. Okay. So that's powerful. So Sally, of course, not super relieved, and she gets to continue on with her life without any of this legal pressure, just like that. Another one I want to talk about is John, who had $60,000 in back taxes from like 6 years of taxes that he wasn't able to pay, and they piled up, and taxes and penalties, and there's liens and levies on his account, and John's life was severely challenged due to this. So he came and he essentially was hopeless at this point. It had been about 6 years or something, 6-7 years of this issue going on, and it literally took about, I believe it was like 6 to 8 months of back and forth, and then all of the liens and levies were canceled and withdrawn, and literally it went poof, and the account didn't even exist anymore. Okay, because I also want to point out, all of you who are in the Black's Law Dictionary, I want you to look up the word discharge. Okay, the first sentence is, discharge is generic, right? Well, generics, like the soda at the grocery store on the bottom shelf in the soda aisle that says cola on it, and it's nondescript. When it happens, it's not made a big deal of, or it's not mentioned most of the time. It just happens, and it's just there. So that's the kind of stuff we see typically. So at this point, I want to rewind a little bit. Equity in Latin is equitas. It was back in the ancient Roman system as well. It's in the Bible. I think it's Psalms 98:9 talks about how our Creator can rules with righteousness of the people on the earth through equity. I believe that's right. Scriptures 98:9, I believe. And so it's in the wisdom commands of the scriptures. Even it goes back, it's natural law. It goes back to the fair dealing of men and women and other men and women. This is a fundamental thing, and it made its way through time, through Greece, through Rome, ended up in England, and our modern incarnation is the Chancery Court, which was overseen by a bishop. It was called the Court of the King's Conscience. Okay, so that became part of the common law system. But even if it's not the common law system, I want to let you know, even civil countries, the scholars of law look to the equitable maxims to make their statutory laws and all of those type of things. So it's at the foundation of civil law as well as common law, which covers about 240 nations in the world right there. And any country that's part of the IMF who's using the negotiable instruments law or uniform commercial code or an incarnation of that also has to agree to these same type of commercial laws that equity is working through in the modern age. Okay, so that kind of brings us up to speed, and it came over from England and also became part of this nation. So equity works in all of these nations, and there's students in Australia, Canada, Ireland, Scotland, all over the place. So it's the bedrock of what is right in law. It's the conscience of law. It's parallel to law, and it steps in to remedy the wrongs or the inefficiencies or deficiencies, inequities in law. So that's kind of the history in a nutshell. And I also want to let you know that we have more to share. There's only so much time in this presentation, so we're excited to be hosting a private webinar in the near future for all of you who are interested. We're going to invite you into the private fellowship, and there we can share more with our private members, because there's a big delineation between private and public, and you may not, some of you know what the difference is and some don't, but it's even on the Federal Reserve notes, all debts public and private. So it's a pretty big thing, even printed on those notes. Okay, and you can pull one out of your wallet and look at that. But we're going to be hosting a private webinar where we're going to be sharing more details and more things that we can share with our private members. So I just want to throw that out there, because this is empowering, this is life-changing stuff, and when we know how to navigate it, any piece of paper with your name on it falls into this remedy. So anything you're presented with, any charges, as Clint alluded to earlier, everything's commercial, and in court they call it, for instance, if it's not truly criminal, there's no injured party and things of that nature, and you didn't victimize anybody, It's a commercial matter. It's a paper monster. It's service of the court. You know, I've had better service at a McDonald's than I have at court, but you know, they're there to serve. It's called court service or process, okay? And what that is that they're processing negotiable instruments through a bank. Essentially, the judge is a banker, the bench is a bank. Even a friend of mine who's from Germany, the same word, bench and bank, it's the same word. And so you start to see the commonalities, and it's right in front of your face. The banking terms are synonymous with the legal terms, and there's a reason for that, because everything changed into a commercial matter. So think about that for a minute. It's just about indemnifying the Federal Reserve. Franklin Delano Roosevelt pledged to ask Congress to indemnify the Federal Reserve. Now, who's indemnifying them? Yes. And it's all the property, it's all of our creative energy. Everything is being quantified and harnessed to be extracted through this elaborate scheme that Edward Mandell House talked about in The Fruits of the Poisonous Tree. They made it so indirect, and we don't understand that this piece of paper that has our name on it might be worth $300 million on the Securities and Exchange market, and we have no idea. And that charge is not because you broke the law. That charge is there to indemnify the Federal Reserve. They have to issue credit and move it through the system. Hopefully this has been enlightening, and I can share much more, but thank you everyone for listening.
Cool. Thanks, Phil. So what Phil was talking about just a moment ago in regards to the webinar and the difference between public and private, I want to create a distinction that sometimes really like clunks people over the head. If you created a corporation, no, let me give you another example. You have your property and it's fenced in, and your neighbor decides to jump over that fence and say, hey, neighbor, I want you to cut this tree down, and I want you to make a house over here, that I want you to block this creek so I can start using some of this water. Well, you're probably going to say, take a hike, right? So now put yourself into the seat of the United States Federal Corporation. And earlier I said, the one who creates controls. We didn't create the Federal Corporation. Someone else did. Whoever, I don't care, but I didn't. I'm not party to it. So if I try to go into their system and change it, what are they going to do? Get out of here, right? Or they're going to try to, harass me. And if I'm in a contract, then they'll just use that contract to bound me up somehow, some way, right? Or they'll just flick me. I'm not trying to step into their system and change it. I'm not interested in reforming what they've created. That's not my business. So when Phil is talking about, we're going to go have a private event where everyone comes into our private arrangement in private assembly, where we vow that we're coming in as sentient men and women and not corporate fictions, we mean that very seriously. We don't want the third party state intervening in our private conversation. So we want to invite you into a private, exclusive webinar where you come into that private establishment and we're all on the same page as sentient men and women to have a deeper conversation. This is considered a public forum. We're not going to divulge a private remedy in a public forum. That's like me going in there trying to disrupt their system. And what are they going to do? They're going to flick me. I'm not interested in that challenge. But what I am interested in doing is inviting you guys into a private event so we can talk about it more deeply. So that's where PMAs came in, right? But people just aren't using them properly. They don't get it yet. They don't really understand the difference between public and private. Getting there, but we just got a little bit more sharpening to do. Anyway, I wanted to share that. And now we're going to invite you guys into what we call the Equity Revelations private webinar. It's complimentary, and you guys just become a member and you come in, and then there's some special invitations for you that can save you guys up to $1,000 all in all. And it's phenomenally educational. And there's a Q&A at the end of it. There's like 11 or 12 questions, but they are so impactful and so.
Thanks again. You guys are a real gift to us tonight and a real gift to mankind. Let the future be filled with equity, honor.
Yes. Thank you. Blessings.
You.
Yeah. really an
Yeah.
honor to be here. I love sharing this with people. You could probably tell how excited I am. It's a deep passion of mine, and all this has come through in a big way. So very honored, very blessed to be here. So thanks, Clint. Thanks for your time, and thanks for sharing your folks with us and us with you.
All right. You're doing God's
Thanks.
work. God bless everyone and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Blessings.